darbars, one in 1877, the other in second in 1903. 1877 was to commemorate the accession of Queen Victoria. 1903 was about Edward VII, and 1911 was George V, basically 1911 Darbar. And it was at the third imperial. So all these three imperial Darbars are held at New Delhi, Delhi. It was not New Delhi then, of course, basically. And it was at the third Darbar, which is the 1911 Darbar, where George V, the British monarch, who was physically present, announced the transfer of capital from Calcutta to Delhi, which was completely unexpected, and it was kept secret till the last moment, basically. Now, what happened at the 1911 Darbar, basically? 1911 Darbar, the partition of Bengal was annulled. And foundation, new capital was announced, that the capital has shifted to New Delhi, and foundation stones were laid in an area which is around the Burari village now. You have a coronation, a park there, now when you go, you have a coronation park very close to the place. So this is an area where the foundation stone of the new capitals were raised, basically in the Burari village. Now, why this decision to move on out of Bengal, basically? And these are primarily two. One was that, the partition of Bengal, as we all know, and the rising nationalist agitation had created a lot of unrest, just going beyond the Swadeshi movement. There were political assassinations, there were bombings. And so the division of Bengal had backfired on the British. And even the Morlemento reforms, basically that 1909 had failed to assuage the feelings of the growing nationalist sentiment. So the idea was to annul the division, division, which was basically done along communal lines. That was one. And the second one that they were facing continuously is that they wanted to give Bengal some element and same status as the Madras and Bombay presidencies, which is now Bombay is now known as Mumbai, of course, and Madras is now known as Chennai. So they wanted to give this, status and provincial autonomy. So there was this demarcation between the supreme government and the provincial government. And it was connected to the idea of greater devolution of power, basically to give to the Bengal government. And that connected to that was these two seats could not be the same. The seat of provincial government and seat of supreme government could not be same. So therefore, the idea was to move away from that part, basically, and to get some other part. Now, why Delhi? Because Delhi, one of those things which, there were two factors once again here. Basically, one is the idea of location. So location-wise, Delhi was very, very close to Shimla, which happened to be the summer capital of the British Empire, basically. So that will save a lot of time. Delhi was equidistant from the two major commercial centers, Bombay and Calcutta. Delhi, the position at Delhi gave them better access to the princely states of northern, central, and western India, basically. And Delhi also was at a very critical junction of railway routes. So the location was very important part of it. But the second part, as I said at the beginning, was equally important, the symbolism part. Delhi had featured, as Dr. Tiwari also mentioned, it was an ancient city associated with Hindu mythology and sacred legends. Delhi was a seat of historic empires, the Delhi Sultanate, the Mughal, and had remained a capital for a very long time, basically in all these years. And the 1857 rebellion had showed that how the Red Fort, the Mughal Empire, and Delhi continued to be the symbolic center of power in India. And so Delhi was chosen one, Now, what they did was, the first idea was, and Lord Hardinge, who was the viceroy at that point of time, during 1911, he was very clear that he's not going to assign it to the PWD, the Public Works Department. So he wanted to have through a small committee, which was a powerful committee, which would execute it in a very specific purpose. So the first thing that was done is to form a town planning committee, and three people became important here: John Brodie, Swinton, and Edwin Lutyens. Edwin Lutyens, who later becomes the architect of many of those buildings in New Delhi. The first two had expertise in municipal affairs. One was a municipal engineer, John Brodie, and Lutyens was then not known as a very, he was known more for designing expensive countryside homes, basically. Very expensive homes, but not, known in the same way that Baker was known for designing government buildings. Baker would design government buildings in South Africa. But Lutyens could, make it to the town planning committee. So these three people were there. And the first thing that was given the task of this town planning committee was to identify a suitable site. And in the course of finding a suitable site, quite a few options were explored. The first option that was explored, that why not have it at the same place, where the foundation stones were laid, which is eastern Delhi, close to the Yamuna River. But then that was ruled out because, it was prone to flooding and the water level was very high. So they were not very keen, to have it here. The second site that was also looked at as is the site around Narayana. But it was felt that somewhere it was not connected to the historic cities of Delhi, right? Somewhere it was off of the historic essence of Delhi. So that was also ruled out. And they also thought at one point of time that why not convert this, the civil lines, that they had built, and also parts where they had built in around Shahjahanabad, why not build on that? But the idea of raising the structures or, aligning with those structures was a very expensive proposition. So that was also ruled out. And finally, what they settled on is a village which extended from Malcha, which is near Chanakyapuri, to Purana Killa. So there was a village, which was existing there. Now, what was that village? This village was a village which was not too occupied in terms of not too many constructions were there. Of course, there were ruins, historic ruins there, and people were engaged in cultivation and other, non-agricultural occupations. And it had, a very towering presence by way of, in the center of the Raisina Hills. Now, the Raisina Hills would give a very towering view of Delhi, and from there you could see all the cities of Delhi. Now, there were differences over the layout as well, because, initially Lutyens was proposing a layout of a principal avenue from, Malcha, that region near Malcha, basically Malcha village, to somewhere around the Jama Masjid. It would end around that, but Harding ruled that out. And Lord Harding himself took a very direct interest in deciding the layout of the principal avenue. So the first thing that had to be done, yes, the site has been identified. Now let us identify the principal avenue, right? And there Harding decided that it will be from Raisina Hill to the Purana Killa. So which is now known as the Rajpath, basically. So that was the principal avenue that was identified. There were also plans at that time to integrate Yamuna, which had changed course, basically. So, bring Yamuna back to its original course and develop a riverfront. And there were also plans to integrate the old city of Shahjahanabad with the new city, as well, through widening of the roads and things like that. And so the two things settled. The site is settled now, and the layout of the principal street is settled now. The third thing was basically about who are going to be the architects and what is going to be the architectural style, right? And here Harding was being a bit conscious. Lutyens, who was already in the town planning committee, was already drawing some sketches, basically. And many of his plans that he drew were actually, rejected by the town planning committee. Now, Lutyens was keen to get into this, and he was thinking that he'll get the entire commission of that, basically. Lord Harding was very, very anxious, and he thought that, the choice of architects was closely linked to the architectural style the architects preferred, basically. Very apprehensive of Lutyens because, Lutyens was very disdainful of Indian architecture. He thought there's nothing there in Indian architecture. On the contrary, he was a great exponent of classical Western architecture, the classical European architecture, which is the Greco-Roman style, basically. Now, two or three people, so there is a very, sharp division of lines there, basically. George V, who was the monarch, British monarch, Lord Harding, who was the viceroy, E.B. Hevell, who was the principal of, Calcutta School of Art, and they were at George Bernard Shaw as well. They were arguing for an Indian, design, or a substantial Indian component, George V, Indian, even suggested to Lutyens that, even the Mughal style would be good. But they wanted to have an Indian component in the design, right? But as I said, Lutyens was very much against the Indian design. He said that, there's nothing there, basically. He was actually disdainful, that. So what Lord Harding did was, he tried to strike a compromise, and that there he played a bigger role, basically. And he tried to neutralize Lutyens by bringing in two more people. One was Baker, Herbert Baker. Now, Baker is one person who has been earlier, involved with the design of many government buildings in South Africa. And then, when he comes, during the time when these discussions are happening, he published a piece, where he talked about blending the good elements of East and West, basically. So he became a natural choice that, look, here is a person who is talking sense now. But, with Baker, he was a bit of a diplomat. So he could put his words very carefully as opposed to Lutyens, who would put it very bluntly. So Baker, at heart, Baker also was in favor of European classical architecture. And that was the beginning point for him as well, right? But he said that, and he comes up with a position that European classical style adapted to local climate and materials, right? And finally, so this was the second person. Harding also brought in the third person known as Swinton Jacob. Now, Swinton Jacob was a designer who had been known for his designing buildings on what is popularly known as the Islamic or Indo-Sasanic style. He had designed St. Stephen's College and Kashmiri Gate, also Delhi College in Indore, basically, and some other structures, And he was known as some kind of a person who had who knew the Indian architecture very well. So he was brought in as an advisor or an associate. So after bringing those things in, Harding then said that, okay, these are the people who could be the architects of New Delhi. What was agreed was, as a compromise was struck. And according to the compromise, there were two elements to it. So they will follow the Western classical architecture for the larger purposes of construction. And the Indian architecture or Indian architectural style would only be used for ornamentation and decoration. Right? This is also interestingly very, very symbolizes very strongly with what the British rule happened, getting Indians into the political representation in a very ornamental sense. So this echoes very well with what is happening in the political circle as well. Now, so this was the compromise that was struck in terms of architectural style. And these three people became a part, two primarily and one as an associate. Now, Baker was associated with the twin secretariat buildings. Lutyens was given the charge of what was known as the Government House and later became the Viceroy House, now known as the Rashtrapati Bhavan. And Baker was given in charge of the twin secretariat buildings, now known as the North and South Block, basically, right? But later they went on to design other buildings as well. And the rest of the buildings were done with PWD, the Public Works Department, and some people, some people from the Imperial Delhi Committee that they architects are there. And these were done with the help of contractors, right? And many Indian contractors were there who were supplying labor and overseeing some parts of the operations, basically the physical part of the operations. And Sujan Singh, Sujan Singh Park, near the Khan Market, also happened to be one of those Indian contractors there as well, right? So it is, so there are architects, then there is a PWD, then there are some government architects, and then there are Indian contractors who are, becoming involved in this part of this thing. This then comes after having the site is done, the architects have been finalized, the architectural style has been finalized. Then came the idea of preparing the ground, basically clearing the ground, leveling the ground, and executing the planning part of it, right? And there they formed a special enclave, basically, which was created for New Delhi, right? And which was put in the charge of a chief commissioner, which was Malcolm Haley. Now, Malcolm Haley is the same person after whom Haley Road or Haley Lane is named, basically. If you see the Haley Lane, which is near the Agrasen Bawali, some of you are familiar with Delhi. Now, this was, this amounted to an acquisition of around 40,000 acres of land. Right? So the whole land was divided into 5 zones, out of which 2 zones were immediately important to them. One was the Delhi Imperial Zone, Imperial Delhi Zone, basically, or Imperial City area. right? And the second was the cantonment area, which was near. So the other three zones, they said, okay, they will be used for future development of Delhi, right? But these two zones were the immediate areas of concentration for them, basically. Now, this area, the land was, under different kinds of activities. So there are people who have been working on this land, and there are, lots of historic monuments which are there as well. So because of historic ruins, this area was also known as Khandarat, basically, which means, Khandarat, Khandar, basically from Khandar, Khandarat, basically. Now, what is happening is that, there are laborers, there are agricultural laborers, there are agriculturists, there are non-agricultural people, and then there are, basically there are some other, when you talk about non-agricultural people, we are basically talking about people who had, shops there, or people who had houses there, or people who had place of work there. So in general, the idea of acquisition was gone ahead with compensation in cash as well, right? Now, for the agriculturalists, some of them, they were paid in cash, and some of them were also given, lands in the Punjab Canal colonies, which were available at a higher rates. And some of them were even allowed to cultivate till the area had come in for future development. And some of them were even offered for short leases, So agricultural operations continued in some bits of there. For the non-agricultural bit, they created a kind of a 20-acre land, they created somewhere near the Jangpura region, what is now known as Jangpura region, right? Now, this is interesting that they were to be resettled there. And this thing was being overseen by Mr. Young, who was the deputy commissioner. So it became Youngpura first, right? And then from corruption, it comes Jangpura. So, there's a very interesting episode about this thing. So this is how they were given. As far as the historic monuments were concerned, there were two lists which were drawn. One was an initial list of around 1912, and then there was an Archaeological Survey of India list, which was prepared by the Deputy Superintendent called Zafar Hasan, and therefore is very famously known as the Zafar Hasan listing of the monuments of Delhi, basically. And then on the basis of that, they were categorized as leave it, these areas need to be preserved. So primarily on the basis of these two listings, they selected the monuments, and some were done away with, some were allowed to stay, or the older monuments were began to stay. And the stones that was used from the monuments that were raised was used for concrete and the road purposes as well. But some of the monuments actually, were used for framing of the new capital. So that was also important, And that brings me to the second part of it, which is the layout and planning. Now, we have already discussed that how when we're talking about layout and planning, there were two main road avenues, right? One is the Kingsway, which is now known as the Rajpath, and one is the Queensway. So these are the two axes that ran at right angles to each other. Queensway, which is now known as the Janpath, The Viceroy's house, which was at the top of the Raisina hill, was the center of everything that was to happen, basically, right? And then as per the initial plans, towards the south of this, the city, they were planning to have some kind of a cathedral. Towards the north, they were planning to have, some kind of a railway station, surrounded by circular arrangement of administrative and municipal offices, post offices, and shops and hotels. So, which is the southern end. The southern end was the one which developed into the central business district called the Connaught Place area, which we will talk about later. But this developed into the Connaught Place area and the Gold Market area, the Gold Dakhana area. Now, interesting bit is that all important avenues of the imperial city were framed by historical landmarks, right? So to the south lay the Lodhi Gardens, and the subjugate tomb. Sorry, if I'm not too sure whether I use the word north and south, but the northern side is the railway station or the Connaught Place area. To the south is the Lodhi Gardens and the Safdarjung tomb, right? And if some of you who have who go towards the Lodhi Garden area would see that the road which is now known as the Rajesh Pilot Marg if you look at the Lodi Gardens boundary, it's still some of those flats still, or the bungalows still refer to that as the South End Road. So that marked the southern end of the new city, basically, right? And what was done is the Lodi Garden, there is a village which has called Khairpur, which had come up. So that village was cleared. Or that Lodi Garden area was occupied by a village that had come up earlier. So that was cleared. In the north, beyond the Connaught Place area, was the Jama Masjid, which was the quintessential mosque, the congregational mosque of the 17th century Mughal capital, Shahjahanabad. Towards the east was the Purana Killa, right, which was again, a very important, a monument which was connected both with the Mughals and with the Surs, basically. Now, there was another thing that was agreed upon. Lutyens had initially suggested that the whole city would be done on grids, which was completely rejected. And it was said that it would be done, this would be a mixed kind of streets, where it would have straight streets, it would have curved streets, it would have, radial roads, and also hexagonal spaces and roundabouts and, triangular spaces, So it was a kind of a mixed kind of streets that was, adopted in the plan. Now, let me come to the Kingsway first. The Kingsway was, the area which, as I said, ran from the Raisina Hills to the Purana Killa region, right? And on the Kingsway, the idea was that the Raisina Hill would only be used as the citadel of power, right? So it was, in the classical European terminology, it was the acropolis on which the Parthenon was to be built. The Parthenon representing the Viceroy's house, which later became the Rashtrapati Bhavan, basically, right? So, and the two secretariat buildings would be located on that, alongside the Viceroy house, and the two secretariat buildings would be located in what was known as the citadel of power, right? This one. And when you think about these two buildings, when you talk about the Viceroy house or the twin secretariat buildings, you can see how the mixing of architectural styles, which was being debated earlier, comes to fruition. So when you look at the Rashtrapati Bhavan, you have the dome and the railing, which is inspired by Sanchi. Then you have the Mughal gardens, right? But you have, so these are being in the top, but you have what you see by way of a very, impressive or imposing facade, a colonnade, which is inspired by the row of colonnade and columns, which are inspired by the Greco-Roman style, very, very predominantly Greco-Roman style of that, basically, right? But the other element which gave an Indian touch to these architectural interventions was the use of the red and buff sandstone. They had also been used in the Sultanate buildings, and they had also been used in the Mughal buildings as well. And when you look at the twin secretariat buildings, alongside, the columns and the colonnade, the European columns of the classical, you see the Renaissance kind of domes, you see the round arches, but by way of Indian motifs, you see chhajjas, which are cornices, to merely prevent heat and sunlight and rains, basically. So if you see the chhajjas, the chhatris at the top, you see the jalis, basically, which are perforated screen. You see, by way of decorative heads, carved brackets, which were again a very interesting Indian features, and elephant heads on the pillar capitals. So these, so the combination of this architectural elements comes to fore, very, alongside all these elements, there in the New Delhi side, basically, or in the two buildings. Now, when you going further down that the Kingsway, there is a Victory Square, which is now known as the Vijay Chowk. So it was a spacious plaza which was framed by fountains, and it was used for ceremonial purposes, and later used for beating the retreat ceremony, basically, which we are familiar with. And the side between the Victory Square, which is the Vijay Chowk, and the India Gate, which came in later, was dotted by lawns, pools, and rows of trees, basically, right? So this is a very, very spacious boulevard which is being developed, along the principal ceremonial avenue. The principal ceremonial avenue is also known for its symmetry. It was like a grand axis, right, which had a very important statement to make, basically. And this is the line where this Republic Day parade has been held, for a very long period of time. So and though so now the interesting bit, when you look at those buildings, you see that, one question that arises, that why is the parliament, the current parliament, building, which was earlier known as the council house, not along that citadel or the central axis or central imperial axis? And the simple reason for that, what it was never a part of the original plan. So the functions of parliament or or a representative institution was initially done house. So the Viceroy's house initially functioned as a space where all kind of representative institutions would be there in the Viceroy's house as well, right? So it functioned as the Viceroy's house was the center where any representative office would be there, right? Later, during the Montague Chelmsford reform, extended the political representation, and there came a need for a separate building to make a kind of a provision for a bicameral legislature, which was basically a council of states, which later became the Rajya Sabha, and the Legislative Assembly, which became the Lok Sabha. And through a proclamation of George V, the monarch, he said that we need to have the princes also involved in the so chamber of princes was also made, basically. So when you see, it appears as a colosseum of three semicircular chambers. So these three semicircular chambers, each representing Council of States, the Legislative Assembly, and the Chamber of Princes. They were connected to a central chamber where the Tryst of Destiny speech, by the first Prime Minister was held, basically, right? And for the legislatures, basically, two hostels were created, which is along the Janpath now, which is along the Queensway, which is the Eastern Court and the Western Court. So they were used for visiting legislatures. Now, for the Indian and here one can see elements of discrimination or segregation there. For the Indian legislatures, there were separate structures called orthodox quarters. And later, when the need for including more Indian legislatures arised, they sold off the Eastern Court to the Post and Telegraph Department, and from the funds that were raised, they created more orthodox quarters. So these elements are, one could see those elements there as well. Now, like the Council House or the later Parliament, as I said, basically, India Gate also came in later. It was not a part of the original plan. The work begins, in the 20s, it was not a part of the original plan. And it came in because it was done, constructed in the memory of soldiers who had died during the First World War and the Third Afghan War. The names you could still see there, right? The First World War had brought in several complications. One, that, everything got delayed. There were price hikes. The budgets went in for a toss. The estimates for construction went on from 917 lakhs to around 1419 lakhs. There was a delay in supply equipment because all of them were geared to war efforts. Many of the skilled engineers had been shifted to war efforts. There were high freight charges. But the First World War also led, because of this, the death of soldiers, also led to the construction of a new arch-shaped memorial, thing, which was later became known as the India Gate, around a large hexagonal space, right? So I'm now talking about the India Gate, what we call the India Gate roundabout. So it was a hexagonal space where you have, a arch-shaped war memorial which has come up. And the area around the hexagonal space was developed as a Prince's Park. Now, princes were taken as a part of, taken as collaborators. They were seen as bulwarks against the rising tide of nationalism. So the idea was to collaborate with them. So as soon as the New Delhi project comes into being, what they do is they ask, the princes to buy land, and they're encouraging the princes to buy land. And a lot of princely states would, gather to buy land. and so there were eventually around 36, princely state, who occupied land from 4 to 8 acres, basically in extent, Now, the location would also depend on the power and proximity to the British, right? Now, there are two other things that are very, very important to note here, basically, that while we are doing this, while the princely states are being, included in around in the Princess Park area, and some of them you would know, Baroda House, Bikaner House, lot of them you would know, basically. So the first ones to be made were Bikaner House and the Hyderabad House. Hyderabad is now used for various, when the PM meets the visiting foreign dignitaries, basically. And towards the end to when the thing was being inaugurated in 1931, New Delhi was being inaugurated. Baroda House and the Travancore House were under construction. Now, there are two specific elements that I want to draw your attention to. One was this location of the Princess Park. So it was from a distance, right? From the top of the Raisina Hill, which is where the Viceroy's house was there. And there is a distance, and then there is a roundabout, India Gate roundabout. So the idea was that, in symbolic terms, they were creating some kind of a permanent darbar, right? But at a distance. So they were segregated. They cannot come to the center of power. So the element of power and race also played a very important part in this symbolism, right? And it is not just, it is hierarchy and segregation does not come into play in just the spatial arrangement of the princely houses. It also comes into play in the allotment and in the construction, size, quality, and location of the residential, bungalows as well, or residential spaces as well, right? Now, the idea was, one of those things that they wanted to talk about then is that, they would need people. So in New Delhi, there are British, there are Europeans, and they want Indians, right? There are Indians which are already there who have been, taken out and who have been asked to move out of that. But they need for the servicing of them, they needed Indians. Now, one of the assumptions was that the Indians were, staying in the Purana Old Delhi, what became known as the Old Delhi or Sajanabad area. So one was the assumption was they'll keep traveling to the New Delhi area, right? But then there's another counterpoint going on, another perspective going on that, they could, there are huge sanitation issues in the Old Delhi area. Old Delhi becomes known as Old Delhi after the New Delhi comes into being. So there are problems of sanitation and there are problems of infection could be there, right? So on these grounds, they said, no, let us keep them in rent-free, accommodation here only, right? So the Indians, were asked to people who would serve those, the machinery there would stay in rent-free accommodations within that. Now, there are interesting, segregations or stratification, which is seen both among the British and between the British and the Indians. So let me talk about the first part. Even among the British officials, it was a stratified society. So, and which was, basically arrived at on grounds of, the position that you held in the official bureaucracy and your rank and the salary. So the ones which were superior were allotted huge bungalows, compounds as they would call it, with massive, spaces for, servants, with the Indian servants. And so they were big compounds, as they would they came to be known as, And then there were, provisions for Indian servants, which was at a distance. So again, the idea of sanitation as also noise comes into being. So there are big compounds there. Now, when you look at the houses or of the clerks, you see a very clear cut of racism there, So, for the same rank and the same pay scale, the Anglo-Indian, clerks would get much bigger houses and more refined houses, as compared to the Indian clerks, who were basically housed somewhere near the northern area, somewhere near what is now known as the gold market area. So their facilities were also not so great, as compared to the Anglo-Indian clerks. Then, the other part where the notions of hierarchy comes into play very strongly and very visibly is also in the nomenclature of streets and roads as well, right? So we have already heard about the Kingsway and the Queens, which are the two principal avenues of the new city, the proposed new city. And the roads which were housing the higher ups in the government, superior officers in the government, they were named after British monarch. So Queen Victoria Road would be Rajendra Place, King George Avenue would be the Rajaji Marg, Prince Edward Place would be the Vijay Chowk, right? So those things which were housing very higher ups in the ladder, in the official ladder, those roads were named around the British monarchs. And the second rung of streets were named after important British officials. So Clive Road, which was the Tyagaraja Marg, or Hastings Road, which was the Krishna Menon Marg. And then came the governor generals and the viceroys. So the Harding Road, which was the Tilak Marg, Curzon Road, which was the Kasturba Gandhi Marg. You still have the Chelmsford Road, which near the Press Club, and then in the minor roads in the neighborhoods of the clerks were known after military figures, like Havelocks or John Nicobar. The interesting bit is the Prince's Park bit, right? Now they are all the important. You can see the hierarchy coming down. The higher the area is, the high prestige area would have roads named after the superior British people or officials or monarchs, and the lower ones would be then going down the ladder first. The interesting bit is that they also thought about, they had all, as we discussed, that they had plans to integrate Indian princes. So they also thought about integrating Indian ruling houses, right? And interesting is the location of this. So the Prince's Park, which is the roundabout, near the India Gate. So all the radial roads emerging from there were named after the old rulers or emperors, right? So you have Ashoka Road, you have Shah Jahan Road, you have Akbar Road. So around the Prince's Park. So there is a very interesting positioning and symbolism that is there. So one area which is there, which they are talking about that, and they also had, because Marathas had played a very important part, so Peshwa Road or Sindhya Road, right? And because Jai Singh had played a very important role, this Jai Singh, Jai Singh, the Royal House of Jaipur played a very, very important role, in giving land to the British, So Jai Singh Road was named after after that, and it was known as the Jai Singh Pura. The area was known as the Jai Singh Pura. Interestingly, as Dr. Tiwari was mentioning at the beginning, that Indian, they using also from epics, basically. So the Pandara Road was named as Pandava Road, and it was a corruption of the Pandava Road, to read some wrong listing of that. So that was meant to be the Pandava Road. Then you have the Lodhi roads and all the Prithvi Raj Road, all along the and emerging from the radial roads that have this thing. Now there was one other part of New Delhi project which deserves special mention, and which is that the idea was to build up something like a garden city. Now the garden city concept had come up in the earlier decades of the early part of 20th century, and basically and very broadly speaking, it brought together elements of rural living, good elements or positive elements of rural living and urban living. So you have all the greenery, nature, society, and alongside you have very superior quality of civic, cultural, economic amenities, right? And one of the ways in which it was sought to be achieved in the New Delhi project was to a greening of that, of the New Delhi area, right? And so what trees and greening became of something of specific importance in there. And they there's a book by P.H. Cutterblock, which is the list of Indian trees, which became the basis for selecting the trees, basically, right? And on that, so they were careful choosing of trees for various kinds of avenue. So Aurangzeb Road had neem trees, Akbar Road had tamarind trees, The ridge, which became some kind of an extension, or which gave some kind of an eastern projection, western projection to that, was also leveled, made more scenic, and there was some afforestation done. And the big trees were also planted within the compounds of this thing. So the garden city has come into being along these lines, as well, so that kind of thing. Now, most other buildings that you can see, have come in late 20s and early 30s. Once the principal government buildings have come into being or have reached at a very advanced level. So things like Gold Market comes as the first market space, in 1924. Connaught Place develops, in late 20s, but mostly in 1930s as well. It was named after the Duke of Connaught. It was basically a two-storied colonnaded structure. The lower one would be used for a shop, and the upper one would be used for a house. And there were two concentric circles of buildings in Connaught Place. So, and then within there are a lot of shops, very famous, iconic shops coming up. Wenger's comes up, was set up by a Swiss couple in 1926. And it was not just a shop, it was used for a wedding venue, it was used for ballroom dances, it was used for official parties as well. Then the cinema hall started, this is all happening in 30s. Regal, Rivoli, Odeon, India Talkies coming into being. The Imperial Hotel is being set up in 1930s. It was set up on the grounds of recreating something like an imagination of recreating a 19th century British manor, right, luxury. So it was known for its utensils, the cutlery. It was known for its furniture, and it's known for the Daniel's paintings, famous Daniel paintings, that you could still see at the Imperial Hotel if you go there. And then there is a crescent, which is now known as the Wellington Crescent. That was, on the western side of it. So there are two parts of it. It starts from the Nehru Memorial, Teen Murti Bhavan, and then ends into something called the Gold Dak Khana. So one end of the Teen Murti Bhavan was basically set up was known as the Flagstaff House, and it was the house of the commander-in-chief of the British Army. And later it became Teen Murti Bhavan and also became the residence of India's first prime minister. And the other end was the Gold Dak Khana. And the Gold Dak Khana was, earlier, known as Alexandra Place, and there was the headquarters of the Public Works Department, and also functioned as some kind of a Viceroy's camp post office. But in 1960s, it became the General Post Office, the GPO. Around that, you were also the first Roman Catholic Church was the Sacred Cathedral was set up. Earlier churches like this, St. James Church near Kashmiri Gate or St. Stephen's Church, or the other churches were Anglican churches. So they were first time being set up. What is known as the Ram Manohar Lohia Hospital now was the Wellington Hospital. So they were all being set up, on that. And the thing was, and this is when I'm moving towards the final part of my talk today. 1931, it was inaugurated by Irwin, and there were celebrations on the Raisina Hill. There was during this time, the columns of the Dominion were also unveiled. You could see some columns of the Dominion right in front of the Secretariat buildings, the North Block and the South Block. They have on the capital is a ship which represents the maritime might of the British Empire. But by the time the Dominion columns had come into place, they were given by 4 different countries, South Africa, all the Commonwealth countries, South Africa, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. India had already been struggling towards the Purna Swaraj, already had given the thing towards the slogan towards the Purna Swaraj. So the Dominion status they were trying to bring in. So every part of it was very, very reflective of the political developments and very, very symbolic of them as well. But within 14, 15 years, New Delhi becomes within the inauguration, it could never really take off in such a big way. The streets were not so occupied, and then it gets embroiled into the nationalist agitation in the later 40s. But before that, the Second World War brought a lot of business for the Connaught Place area. But also, there were a lot of structures, which was makeshift structures set up along the Queensway to accommodate the Americans that had who had done that. Purana Killa becomes some kind of a station for the Italian prisoners of war. So all these kind of things are happening, and then comes finally you have the Royal Indian Navy RN trials, where Red Fort becomes the center of attention, and then there is this increasing nationalist upsurge, and finally comes the transfer of power and independence, where Raisina Hill becomes the the citadel of power. Still continues to remain the citadel of power, but it becomes the colonial power. It becomes the citadel of democracy. And there are two or three things which are happening. One is the renaming of the buildings and the structures. Right? So it becomes Rashtrapati Bhavan, North and South Block. Then it becomes the Council House becomes the Shansad Bhavan. Then there are changes in the functioning of these structures. And third, there are Indianization of the of those buildings, basically. So new sculptures are being added, statues are being added in the Parliament complex, or paintings are being included in the Rashtrapati Bhavan complex or in the Parliament complex. And new structures are also being added. For instance, later Parliament got in the Parliament Annex and the Parliament Library as well. And along the same time as the independence comes, what along also comes along with freedom is the partition and the refugees from Pakistan, basically. So the Delhi Muslims are moving towards Pakistan, but Hindus and Sikhs are coming from and settling in Delhi. And there almost 5 lakh people have come in by way of refugees. So the idea is that how do you accommodate them, right? And so the refugee camps come up in Purana Killa and Humayun's Tomb area, Safdarjung Tomb as well. So if you notice that those things which were cleared by the British, Arab Sarai and or the Humayun or the Indarpat in Purana Killa, those become populated again through the refugee camps. These were the things which villages had been cleared by the British. There's a huge increase in the population size, between 1941 to 51 in the census. And the refugees started occupying all the spaces, empty spaces, whether it were Connaught Place or it were the Gurudwaras or the temples or the schools or even barracks as well. Later, the government, Indian government decided to create a 36 permanent rehabilitation colonies, right, to take care of refugees, and they were named after the freedom fighters, right? So something like Lajpat Nagar, Patel Nagar, Tilak Nagar, Malviya Nagar, Rajendra Nagar. All these nagars were created to settle refugees, basically. And the pattern that was followed is low rise, high density settlement areas. So that is the pattern that has come into being to accommodate the refugees. And Okhla and Narayana industrial state was also set up to promote refugee enterprise, enterprise by the refugees. Later, the Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru realized the need for a more systematic development, and the DDA was set up to be the apex planner and developer, and the MCD, the Municipal Corporation of Delhi, was also set up. And alongside, private developers also started coming in, like in the model town area, in the Rajouri Garden area, east of Kailash, Greater Kailash. So this is how it is developing in the 1950s and 60s. Delhi is also doing. Now, alongside, and this is my last section that I have come to. There is a very interesting contradiction that is happening. While New Delhi is going for a new classical architecture, right? World over, there is a movement which is called the Modernist Movement, which is happening, which had started taking shape after the First World War. This is the Modernist Movement in architecture. So while New Delhi is experimenting with the new classical style, the world is moving towards the Modernist Movement, right? And when the Modernist Movement were basically, broadly speaking, it means architecture devoid of ornamentation. They used glass and steel, and the emphasis was on functionality. And there were 3 different, prominent schools or say groups, basically. One was the US, which was Frank Lloyd Wright, which, talked about organic, growth, organic architectural style, which is connects with environment and society. And in Europe, there was a famous Gropius school, which used, cubic blocks of glass, brick and concrete. And then there was somebody who we know more familiar with, Le Corbusier, the Swiss-French architect, who was known for his brutalism and reinforced concrete. So these 3 have a combined effect on the architecture of modern architecture of Delhi. This is mostly during the 1950s and 60s. This happens. So the first round of modern architecture happens by way of the influence of these 3 different kinds of the modernist movements and the people, the architects who were influenced by them. So they are the people who have been, educated and trained in, either America or Europe, and they are the first generation modern architects are coming up. They're using local sensitivities and local material with their modern education, right? So some kind of a modern Indian architectural style is taking shape, which is connected with the idea of nation building. And the first prime minister was very, very keen to patronize them, these kind of the modern architects. And some of those that you can, and alongside that you also have foreign architects coming in. So Le Corbusier was involved with Chandigarh, and he had influenced many people in India. So the Sri Ram Center or the ISBT or the IIT buildings are influenced by the first this kind of 50s and 60s kind of a modern architectural style. And later, what you see is basically in 1970s and 80s, they are going beyond Wright or Gropius or Corbusier, and having a more holistic kind of approach. And Delhi's first skyscrapers start coming in. We have architects like Charles Correa, Raj Grewal, Romy Khosla. So the Jeevan Bharati building or the Palika Kendra building is representative of kind of this kind of a style. So it has been in continuous evolution. And as I talk now, or as I concluding my talk now, New Delhi is going for another makeup, which is the Central Vista Redevelopment Plan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sasankji. This was a fascinating lecture, actually. Free-flowing, very informative, and also very explanative. You talked about the location, the geographical significance, the symbolism, but the most important thing, what about, is that hierarchy and segregation point. And you not just touched upon the making up New Delhi before the independence, but you also elaborated how it came in the shape after independence. So thank you so much for this. This is a very important lecture. I think this is very good for our students also. There is a small request, Dr. Sasankji. We are planning to publish all these lectures in the form of a book. So if you can please provide us the in a form of paper, this lecture, I will contact personally with you by phone and by email. So please provide that. It will be great. Thank you so much, sir. अब मैं आज के समाहार के लिए माननीय समकुलपति और केंद्र के निदेशक आदरणीय प्रोफेसर सत्यकाम जी को आमंत्रित करता हूं।
धन्यवाद डॉक्टर सुशील तिवारी जी। आदरणीय कुलपति प्रोफेसर नागेश्वर राव जी, जिनके संरक्षण में और जिनके नेतृत्व में हम भारत की आजादी का अमृत महोत्सव मना रहे हैं, भारत के 75वें स्वतंत्रता वर्ष के अवसर पर, प्रधानमंत्री के आह्वान पर मैं सबका स्वागत करता हूं। आदरणीय डॉक्टर शशांक शेखर सिन्हा जी, जिन्होंने विस्तार से दिल्ली के बनने की प्रक्रिया और खास तौर पर जो इसके स्थापत्य के विकास की जो यात्रा की उनके साथ हमने, उनका मैं स्वागत करता हूं। और सभी निदेशकों को और क्षेत्रीय केंद्र के निदेशकों को मैं प्रणाम करता हूं। आप लोग लगातार इस कार्यक्रम से जुड़ते हैं और आपके माध्यम से अपने विद्यार्थियों तक पहुंचते हैं और विभिन्न चैनलों के माध्यम से, जो हमारे पास 5 चैनल्स हैं, इसके अलावा रेडियो का जो चैनल है हमारा ज्ञानवाणी, उसके द्वारा हम अपने विद्यार्थियों तक पहुंचते हैं। और यही इग्नू की खासियत है कि हमारी आवाज दूर तक जाती, दूर तक सुनी जाती। और इस कार्यक्रम की एक खासियत है कि हर एक सप्ताह हम एक नए विषय पर बातचीत करते हैं। इतिहास तो हर एक विषय में समाहित होता है, और आज भी इतिहास के एक पन्ने को हमने देखा है। हम सब जो दिल्ली में रहते हैं, वो दिल्ली को धीरे धीरे अपना लेते हैं। दिल्ली सभी को स्वीकार करती, किसी का परित्याग नहीं करती। ये